Part 1. Problem Framing: One versus Many BVR Intercept. This analysis begins by stripping the scenario down to its operational core. A single fighter aircraft is tasked with a brief offensive defensive interception. It leaves friendly airspace, detects an incoming formation of hostile fighters pursuing a return strike package, launches beyond visual range BVR missiles, and immediately turns back. The engagement window is intentionally compressed, on the order of seconds, so the pilot is not attempting to fight a prolonged battle but to disrupt, deter, or attrit the incoming force just enough to protect friendly assets. This is not air superiority warfare, it is a time constrained denial action. The geometry of the situation matters more than the narrative. The defender starts with a positional advantage inside friendly airspace, but must cross the boundary of to achieve radar detection and firing parameters. The hostile formation is assumed to be approaching in a loosely coordinated group, not yet merged into a close-range combat but also not passively exposed. There is no assumption of external support such as AWACS, ground control intercept, or additional fighters. That constraint is critical because it removes the largest force multiplier in modern air combat: shared situational awareness. The aircraft must rely on its own sensors, onboard processing, and pilot decision speed. The central mistake most analysts make at this stage is defining success as how many missiles can be fired. This is a superficial metric. The correct objective function is narrower and harsher: how many distinct enemy aircrafts can be engaged to a meaningful probability of kill within the available time window, without the defender being forced into a reciprocal engagement. In other words, the aircraft is optimizing for damage inflicted per unit exposure time, not for total destruction. To formalize this, four variables define the problem space. The first is missile availability, which sets an upper bound on how many shots can be taken. The second is simultaneous engagement capacity, determined by radar and fire control architecture, which limits how many targets can be actively supported at once. The third is probability of kill, PK, which varies with missile types, launch conditions, and target behavior. This determines whether one missile per target is sufficient or whether multiple shots are required. The fourth is survivability window, which is the time the aircraft can remain exposed before enemy sensors and missiles begin to impose unacceptable risk. These variables interact in non-linear ways. A platform with high missile capacity but low engagement channels cannot fully utilize its payload in a short engagement. A platform with fewer missiles but higher quality weapons may achieve compatible outcomes with fewer shots. A steady aircraft may extend its survivability window, allowing cleaner launches, with a non-stealth aircraft may be forced to fire earlier at a lower probability conditions. The scenario is therefore not about absolute capacity, but about conversion efficiency, how effectively a platform turns its available seconds into credible threats against multiple targets. Another constraint that must be acknowledged is the nature of the so-called fire and forget missiles. While modern BVR weapons are capable of autonomous terminal guidance, they typically require initial mid-course updates before their sensors go fully active. This creates a short but decisive interval during which the launching aircraft must maintain sufficient track quality. The defender cannot simply fire and instantly disengage. There is a minimum support time that must be respected. This time requirement directly reduces the number of targets that can be engaged within a fixed window, especially if the radar must cycle between multiple tracks. The scenario also assumes that the hostile aircraft are not passive targets. Even without detailed modeling of electronic warfare or evasive maneuvers, it must be accepted that not every missile translates into a kill. This is why real-world doctrine often allocates more than one missile per high-value target. However, in a compressed environment and engagement like this, the defender faces a trade-off: allocate multiple missiles to ensure kills on fewer targets, or distribute single missile across more targets to create disruption and force defensive reactions. The latter often aligns better with the mission objective to break pursuit rather than annihilate the formation. Finally, the definition of success must be clarified. In this context, success is not measured by confirmed kills, but by operational effect. If the incoming fighters are forced to break formation and defend against incoming missiles or delay their advance, the strike package gains time and safety. The defender's role is therefore closer to a shock insertion into enemy decision cycle, not a sustained combatant. This framing is essential because it shifts the evaluation of different aircraft from raw firepower to how quickly and effectively they can impose tactical friction on a superior number of opponents. Part 2: Radar Fundamentals, Detection, Tracking, and First Shot Control. The entire engagement collapses or succeeds at one layer: radar dominance. Before missiles, before maneuvering, before survivability, there is a single question that decides the shape of the fight. Who sees whom first, at what quality, and with what continuity? If that layer fails, everything else becomes irrelevant. Modern fighter radars fall into three broad categories: mechanically scanned arrays, passive electronically scanned arrays, and active electronically scanned arrays (AESA). The distinction is not academic, it directly defines how many targets you can manage inside your 15 to 40-second window. Mechanical radars are effectively obsolete in this context because they cannot maintain multiple high quality tracks while scanning. PESA systems improve range and power but still rely on a single energy source that must be shared across tasks. AESA radars, by contrast, distribute transmission across hundreds or thousands of individual modules, allowing simultaneous beam steering, rapid track updates, and much higher resistance to jamming. This matters because it is not about detecting one target, it is about managing a cluster of targets under time pressure. The radar must operate in track while scan (TWS) mode, meaning it continues scanning the volume while maintaining tracks on multiple contacts. Each track target is not equal. Some are soft tracks with intermittent data, others are firm tracks suitable for missile guidance. The transition from detection to track to engagement quality track is not instantaneous. It consumes time, and in every combat scenario, time is the only scarce resource that cannot be replenished. Detection itself is governed by the radar equation, but the simplified operational truth is this: detection range scales with radar power, antenna size, and target radar cross section (RCS). Large aircrafts are easier to detect. Small aircrafts or stealthier aircraft compress detection range. This creates asymmetry. A platform like the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor or the Chengdu J-20 reduces its own detectability, meaning it can often achieve a first look advantage, even if its radar is not overwhelmingly more powerful. In contrast, non-stealth platforms rely on raw radar performance and electronic warfare to compete in that system. However, detection range alone is not decisive. What matters is track stability. A radar might detect a formation at long range, but it cannot maintain consistent updates across multiple targets. It cannot support missile launches effectively. This is where AESS systems outperform older architecture. They can allocate time and energy dynamically, maintaining high quality tracks on priority targets while still scanning for additional contacts. In practical terms, this increases the number of targets that can be simultaneously engaged, which directly fits into the question of how many missiles can be launched in a short window. Another constraint emerges at this stage: target prioritization. When a radar sees multiple incoming fighters, it doesn't treat them equally. The fire control system ranks them based on parameters such as range, closure rate, aspect angle, and perceived threat level. In a 30-second engagement, we do not have the luxury of engaging everything. S- Thus, selecting which subset of targets will receive engagement quality tracks first. That selection determines how many missiles can be launched before the fighter must turn away. The concept of first look, first shot, first kill becomes central here. If the fighter detects and tracks the enemy before they before the enemy achieve the same on the fighter, The fighter can initiate missile launches under favorable conditions. If the enemy detects the fighter at the same time or earlier, the fighter's survivability window shrinks, forcing the fighter to either fire prematurely or reducing missile effectiveness or abort entirely. This is why radar performance cannot be separated from survivability. Detection is exposure. There is also the issue of update rate. When engaging multiple targets, the radar must revisit each track frequently enough to maintain accuracy. If too many targets are being tracked, the update interval for each increases, degrading track quality. This imposes a hard ceiling on how many targets can be supported simultaneously. If a radar can technically track dozens of targets, only a smaller subset can be maintained at the precision required for missile guidance. This is the origin of the gap between targets tracked and targets engaged. Finally, radar performance is not isolated from electromagnetic environment. Electronic warfare systems both on board and from the enemy attempt to degrade detection and tracking. Jamming can reduce effective range, create false targets, or break track continuity. Advanced fighters integrate electronic support countermeasures to compensate. This introduces further complexity and time costs. In this scenario, every second spent stabilizing tracks under interference is a second not available for launching additional missiles. The conclusion is straightforward but unforgiving. The number of missiles a fighter can fire in a short engagement is not limited first by how many missiles the fighter carries. It is limited by how many high quality tracks the fighter's radar can establish and maintain while a shrinking time window under potential electronic interference. This is the true gatekeeper of the fighter's one-time interception. Part 3. Missile Guidance Architecture. Why fire and forget is not instant freedom. The phrase fire and forget creates a false impression of autonomy. In real combat scenario, launch, turn and exit within seconds. This creates misunderstanding because it creates the primary source of analytical error. Beyond BVR missiles, modern BVR missiles are autonomous only at the first stage of flight, not at launch. Between those 2 points lies a critical dependency window during which the launching aircraft must still support the missile. That window defines how many targets can be realistically engaged before turning away. A modern, a typical modern air-to-air missile such as AIM-120, AMRAAM, Meteor missile, PL-15 or Astra missile operates in three distinct phases: inertia guidance, mid-course updates, and terminal active homing. At launch, the missile doesn't yet see the targets with its own radar. It is flying on an initial trajectory calculated by the aircraft's fire control system. During this phase, it relies on mid-course updates transmitted from the launching aircraft or another networked source to correct its path as the target moves. The mid-course phase is where the fighter's entire 15 to 40-second engagement compresses into a hard constraint. The missile must be kept on a viable intercept path until its onboard radar seeks until its onboard radar seeker activates. That activation point is often referred to as the pitbull moment, when the missile becomes fully autonomous. Only after this point can the launching aircraft safely disengage without degrading the missile's chances of hitting the target. The problem is that the time to reach this autonomous stage is not negligible. It depends on launch range, target speed, closure rate, and missile kinematics. If the launch at if it is if the launch is at longer range, closer to the maximum reach of the missile, the time to pitbull increases because the missile must travel further before the seeker can reliably detect the target. If the fighter launch closer within the missile's no escape zone (NEZ), the time to autonomy is shorter, but the fighter is then exposed. The fighter have then exposed their own aircraft to greater risk by approaching the enemy. This creates a direct trade-off. Launch early, the fighter can engage more targets in theory, but the fighter must maintain guidance longer, which delays the fighter's exit. Launch late, and the fighter reduces the guidance time but also reduces the number of targets it can engage within the assigned time window. There is no configuration which the fighter can there is no configuration where the fighter can maximize both simultaneously. Another limiting factor is data link capacity. Each missile receiving mid-course updates occupies part of the aircraft's communication and processing bandwidth. The radar must continue to track the target, compute updates, and transmit corrections. This means that if the fighter's radar can maintain multiple tracks, the number of missiles they can effectively guide at once may be lower. Saturating the system degrades update quality, which in turn reduces the probability that the missile will enter the terminal phase with sufficient accuracy. The number of the missile itself also matters. The Meteor missile, for example, uses a ramjet propulsion system that sustains energy longer during flight. This allows it to maintain higher speed deeper into engagement envelope, increasing the effectiveness at longer ranges. In contrast, traditional rocket-powered missiles like the AIM-120 AMRAAM lose energy after their boost phase, rely more heavily on initial launch conditions. The practical implication is that higher energy missile can tolerate earlier launches with less degradation in the endgame performance, slightly easing the constraints of the fighter's short engagement window. However, even the most advanced missile doesn't eliminate the need for initial support. The idea that a pilot can fire multiple missiles and immediately turn away within seconds without consequence is not consistent with how these systems operate. If the aircraft breaks away too early before the missiles have reached autonomous tracking, the missile may miss entirely because they no longer receive updated target information. This introduces the concept of minimum support time. For each missile launch, there is a required duration during which the aircraft must maintain sufficient track quality. When engaging multiple targets, these support windows overlap. The radar must cycle between targets, updating each missile in turn. As the number of targets increase, the time allocated to each decreases, and the risk of degraded guidance rises. This is the mechanism that limits how many targets a fighter can engage in a single pass, regardless of how many missiles the fighter carries. There is also a geometric constraint. If the targets are spread across a wide angular sector, the radar must physically steer its beam across that section to maintain tracks. Wider dispersion increases the time required to revisit each target, further stressing the update cycle. In contrast, tightly grouped targets are easier to manage within a short time frame because they occupy a smaller portion of the radar's field of regard. The final layer is target reaction. Once missiles are detected, either through radar warning receivers or data link cues, the opposing fighters will maneuver, deploy countermeasures, and potentially break formation. This changes their velocity vectors and positions, increasing the need for accurate mid-course updates. In other words, the more targets you engage simultaneously, the more chaotic the tracking problem becomes, and the harder it is to maintain effective guidance for all its missiles. The conclusion is direct. The number of missiles a fighter can fire in a rapid interception is not constrained by it can how quickly it can press the trigger. It is constrained by how many missiles the fighters can support through their mid-course phase until they become autonomous, given the limitations of radar tracking, data link bandwidth, and time. This is why the practical engagement count is always lower than the theoretical missile capacity. Part 4: Missile Performance, Range, Energy, and the No Escape Zone. At this stage, the analysis shifts from how many missiles you can launch to a more decisive question: how much each launch is actually worth. Not all BVR missiles contribute equally. Two aircraft firing the same number of missiles can produce radically different outcomes because missile performance determines whether those shots translate into credible threats or wasted ordnance. The most important concept here is not maximum range, it is the no escape zone (NEZ). Maximum range is the marketing number defined under ideal condition against a non-maneuvering target. The NEZ, by contrast, defines a region in which a target cannot outrun or outmaneuver the missile, even if it reacts optimally. In a short engagement scenario where the fighter fires and disengages quickly, the NEZ becomes the only range band that matters. Outside it, the probability of kill collapses rapidly once the fighter turns away and stops supporting the missile. Modern missiles like the Meteor missile are designed to expand this NEZ as much as possible. Meteor's ramjet propulsion allows it to sustain thrust during most of its flight rather than burning all its energy at launch. The result is a missile that arrives in the terminal phase with high speed and maneuvering capacity, even at extended distances. This effectively pushes the NEZ further out, meaning a pilot can fire earlier and still maintain a credible chance of kill after disengaging. In contrast, traditional solid rocket missiles such as AIM-20 Amram or Astra missile operate on a boost and coast profile. They accelerate rapidly after launch, then gradually lose energy as they glide towards the target. If launched too far out, they may reach the target with insufficient energy to maneuver effectively, especially if the target performs defensive maneuvers. This reduces the effective NEZ relative to their advantage range. The PL-15 sits between these paradigms. While still rocket-powered, it is believed to have a more powerful motor and advanced guidance that extends its effective engagement envelope. Its performance suggests a larger NEZ than older AMRAAM variants. Though precise figures remain uncertain, the key point is that missiles differ not just in how far they can travel, but in how dangerous they remain at the end of the travel. Energy retention directly influences the ability to execute the tactic called as launch and leave. If the missile retains high energy deep into its flight, it requires less precise mid-course guidance and is more tolerant of early disengagement. If it loses energy quickly, it becomes highly sensitive to launch conditions and guidance qualities. In this scenario, where the fighter is intended to turn away within seconds, high energy missile compress the required support time and increases the likelihood that each shot remains viable after the fighter exits. Another dimension is seeker performance. When the missile enters its terminal phase, its onboard radar must detect and lock on the target independently. Advanced seekers have better resistance to jamming, higher resolution, and greater oversight capability. This improves the probability that the missile will successfully acquire the target after going active. A weaker seeker increases the chance that the missile will fail even if it was guided correctly up to that point. Guidance logic also plays a role. Some missiles are optimized for lofted trajectories, while they climb into a higher altitude to conserve energy and extend range before diving. The three constraints: radar, revisit rate, fire control computation, data link bandwidth, and combine all of them combine into a single operational ceiling, the engagement channel limit. This is the maximum number of independent targets that can be engaged with credible probability within a given time period. It is almost always lower than the total number of missiles carried. This explains the apparent paradox that was identified earlier. An aircraft like the Sukhoi 30 MKIs or Dassault Rafale may carry more missiles than it can use effectively in a short engagement. If the engagement channel limit is 4, then launching more than 4 missiles at different targets within the same time window produces diminishing returns. The additional missile either receive degraded guidance or must be delayed, which violates the entire launch and leave constraints. The situation becomes more tighter when considering the requirements for minimal support time discussed earlier. Each missile occupies an engagement channel for a certain duration before it becomes autonomous. During that time, the radar data link must continue servicing it. If the launched missile is launched at the maximum channel capacity, the effective lock on those channels until the missile go active time is very limited. The fighter cannot immediately free them to engage additional targets without compromising the earlier shots. This creates a temporary bottleneck. Not only is there a limit on how many targets can be engaged at once, but also on how quickly the fighter can transition to newer targets. Target geometry further amplifies this limitation. If the incoming formation is spread out, the radar must cover a wider angular sector, increasing the time required to revisit each target. This reduces the effective number of engagement channels available within the fighter's effective time range. In contrast, a tightly grouped formation allows more efficient beam steering and slightly tighter engagement density. However, real formations are rarely perfected, especially once they begin reacting to threats. Another factor is engagement sequencing. In theory, a pilot can fire missiles in a rapid succession at different targets, slightly staggering the launches. In practice, the time required to establish engagement, quality tracks, and maintain guidance means that these launches still overlap significantly. The system behaves as if multiple engagements are launching simultaneously, reinforcing the channel limitation. The consequence is that aircraft design must balance missile capacity with engagement capability. Platforms like the Boeing A-15EX Eagle II or the Sukhoi Su-35 are often described as missile trucks because they carry large number of missiles. However, their effectiveness in short engagements still depends on how many of those missiles can be supported at once. Conversely, an aircraft with fewer missiles but a well-optimized engagement system can achieve similar outcomes within the same time constraint. This leads to a critical correction of the earlier assumption that we discussed. When we reduce the number of targets for aircraft like Rafale or Su-30 MKIs based on a two missile per target doctrine, we are applying a static allocation model to a dynamic system. In reality, the pilot may choose to allocate missiles unevenly, firing two at high priority targets and one at others, even single shots across multiple targets to force defensive reactions. The engagement limit defines how many independent targets can be addressed, but the distribution of missiles across those targets is a tactical decision shaped by the situation. The conclusion is uncompromising. The number of targets that the fighter can engage in this scenario isn't determined by how many missiles the fighter can carry initially, but how many engagement channels can it sustain within the limited time window before the fighter is forced to disengage. This is the truest bottleneck. Every aircraft, regardless of its payload, is ultimately constrained by the system level limit. Part 6: Aircraft by Aircraft Breakdown Translating System into Outcomes. At this stage, the abstraction fails. Radar theory, missile architecture, and engagement channels now have to be applied to real platforms. The goal is not to list specifications, but to understand how each aircraft converts its design into usable combat outputs inside the specific constraint. A short, one-pass BVR engagement followed by immediate disengagement. Let's talk about the Boeing F-15EX Eagle II maximum throughput platform.
The F-15EX is structurally optimized for this scenario. Its large airframe supports a powerful AESA radar and a high missile load, allowing it to convert detection into multiple simultaneous engagement efficiently. It is not constrained by stealth design trade-off, so it maximizes radar aperture and payload intensity. In this context of one-pass engagement, the F-15EX can rapidly build multiple high-quality tracks and allocate missiles across them with minimal delay. In engagement, channel capacity aligns closely with its missile carriage, which is rarely the result. Is a, the result is a platform that can approach its theoretical maximum output within a shorter window. However, its weakness is exposure. Without stealth, it can be detected earlier, compressing its survivability window. It compensates with range, speed, and electronic warfare, but the trade-off remains high, with a higher offensive output causing a greater risk. Eurofighter Typhoon High Energy Interceptor. The Typhoon is optimized for kinetic performance and high energy engagements. Its radar and missile integration allowing it to manage multiple targets effectively, though not at the level of dedicated missile truck platforms. In this scenario, the Typhoon can execute a clean one-pass engagement with a balanced number of targets. Its strength lies in combining good radar performance with high energy missiles, allowing it to maintain effectiveness even when launching at longer ranges. It doesn't dominate any single parameter but performs consistently across all of them. Dassault Rafale Balanced Survivability System. Rafale's design is centered on system integration rather than raw output. Its radar engagement capacity is lower than some peers, but it compensates with high performance missiles and advanced electronic warfare. In this scenario, Rafale cannot engage as many targets simultaneously, but the targets it does engage are more likely to be under credible threat due to missile quality, survivability enhancements. Its electronic warfare suite allows it to operate effectively even when exposed, extending its functional engagement window. The platform trades quantity for consistency and resilience. The Su-30 MKI Legacy Modern Hybrid. The Su-30 MKI combines high payload capacity with an older radar architecture. This creates a mismatch between what it can carry and what it can effectively use in a shorter engagement. In this scenario, it is limited by engagement channels and radar performance rather than missile availability. It can still generate multiple threats, but not at the same efficiency as newer platforms. Its strength lies in endurance and flexibility rather than rapid, high density engagements. Critical insight. The critical insight is that no aircraft maximizes all variables simultaneously. Each design reflects a different optimization strategy. Maximum number of engagements, maximum quality of engagements, maximum survivability during engagements. A short BVR interception is not a clean see target fire missile runaway sequence. It is a compressed chain of detection, track validation, target prioritization, missile assignment, launch, mid-course support, and disengagement. If any link is weak, the entire attack becomes theatrical rather than effective. The aircraft may look aggressive, but the missile will not receive the conditions needed to become dangerous. Phase 1 Entry and Sensor Activation. The first seconds begin before the aircraft fires anything. The fighter crosses into the engagement zone and its radar or passive sensors begin building the tactical picture. If engagement support is absent, the aircraft must rely on its own radar, infrared search and track systems, electronic support countermeasures, and onboard mission computer. This is the first bottleneck. A superior platform doesn't merely detect contacts, it classifies them quickly. The fire control system must be separated from the real aircraft from clutter. The fire control system must separate real aircraft from clutter, decoys, jamming aircrafts, or non-priority targets. In a many versus one scenario, the sorting process is decisive because every second spent verifying targets reduces the firing window. A stealth platform may gain time because it is less likely to be detected earlier, while a large non-stealth missile truck may need to act faster because its own exposure begins sooner. The actual launch sequence may take only seconds. A modern fighter can release multiple BVR missiles in rapid succession, especially if tracks and firing solutions are already prepared. But launching fast is not same as engaging effectively. Each missile must leave the aircraft with a valid target assigned and sufficient initial guidance requirements. A 30-second BVR engagement is not won by the aircraft that merely carries the most missiles. It is won by the aircraft that can complete this chain fastest: detect, classify, track, launch, assign, support, and escape. Any fighter that carries many missiles but cannot compress this chain effectively is carrying theoretical power. The F-15EX benefits because it can convert the launch phase into a dense military missile volley. Its weakness is exposure during the mid-course support. The F-22 benefits because it can delay the enemy detection, allowing a cleaner launch and safer disengagement. The J-20 follows the same logic, but with less publicly verified certainty. The Typhoon performs strongly because it combines the high kinematics when integrated with Meteor class missile performance. Rafale performs well not by volume but by electronic warfare, sensor fusion, and missile quality. The Su-35 produces strong volley density but carries survivability limitations. The Su-30 Mki remains useful but suffers from older radar architecture relative to newer systems. The cleanest way to think about PK is through expected outcomes. Suppose a missile has 40% chance of killing under a given launch condition. Firing 4 missiles at 4 targets doesn't mean 4 kills. It means that the expected result is roughly 1.6 kills. Therefore, considering defensive reactions and correlations between, if 2 missiles are fired at one target, each missile independently has a 40% chance of success, and the combined probability is at 80%. It's a simplified calculation, gives the probability of at least one hit as 1 minus probability that both hits. In this scenario, destruction is not only the useful outcome. A missile can fail to kill and still succeed operationally. If the enemy fighter runs away, dives, deploys countermeasures, or breaks formations, it has been forced out of pursuit geometry. That buys time for the strike package, prevents the enemy from pressing into friendlier airspace. This is critical. A missile launch doesn't need to kill to create tactical effectiveness. It only needs to become credible enough that the enemy must respect it. This is why single shot wide distribution may be rational in a defensive rearguard mission, where the fighter is using missiles as tools of tempo disruption, not as merely killing machines.